Welcome to a journey into the distant past, a journey into a world both familiar and strange. A world of empires and armies, of strategy and conflict. But this is not a story of glorious battles and heroic charges. This is a story of the mind, of the subtle and often brutal ways that ancient armies sought to conquer not just the bodies of their enemies, but their spirits as well. Find a comfortable position. Let your body sink into the surface beneath you. Close your eyes and allow your mind to drift back in time to a world where the clash of steel was often preceded by a war of whispers, a war of fear, a war of the soul. Tonight, we will explore the real tactics of ancient armies, the methods that were often far more brutal than you might imagine. We will journey through the annals of history, from the sun-drenched lands of Egypt and Persia to the rugged hills of Sparta and the sprawling empire of Rome. We will uncover the secrets of psychological warfare, the art of intimidation, and the calculated use of terror. But do not be alarmed. This is a journey of understanding, not of excitement. The stories we will explore are meant to be contemplated, to be absorbed, to be understood as part of the long and complex tapestry of human history. Let the details wash over you, let the stories lull you into a state of deep relaxation, of peaceful slumber. There is nothing for you to do now but to breathe. To breathe in and to breathe out. To let go of the day and to allow your mind to be carried away on the gentle currents of history. We will begin our journey with the very first weapon of war, a weapon that required no iron, no bronze, no wood, but only the power of the human mind itself. Long before the first sword was forged, long before the first shield was raised, humanity understood the power of fear. The earliest conflicts were not just physical contests of strength, but also psychological battles of will. A well-timed shout, a terrifying display of aggression, a chilling war cry. These were the first weapons of war designed to unnerve, to intimidate, to break the spirit of the enemy before the first blow was even struck. This is the essence of psychological warfare, a concept as old as humanity itself. It is the art of manipulating perception, of shaping the thoughts and emotions of your opponent to your advantage. It is the understanding that the human mind is the most vulnerable target, the most fertile ground for sowing the seeds of doubt, of despair, of surrender. Ancient armies, in their own ways, were masters of this art. They understood that a reputation for brutality could be more effective than 1,000 soldiers. They knew that a well-placed rumor could shatter an alliance, that a carefully crafted myth could elevate a leader to the status of a god. They recognized that the fear of the unknown, the dread of what might be, was often more potent than any physical threat. As we journey through the ancient world, we will see how this fundamental understanding of human psychology was woven into the very fabric of warfare. We will see how the greatest military minds of antiquity were not just brilliant tacticians, but also master manipulators of the human heart. And we will begin with a man who conquered not just with his armies, but with his mind. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. The name itself conjures images of a brilliant military commander, a conqueror who forged one of the largest empires in the ancient world. But Alexander's genius lay not just in his battlefield strategies, but in his profound understanding of the human psyche. He was a master of psychological warfare, a king who wielded perception as a weapon, who conquered hearts and minds as skillfully as he conquered cities. Alexander's most effective tool was his ability to adapt, to transform, to become what the people he conquered needed him to be. He did not simply impose his own culture, his own beliefs on those he defeated. Instead, he absorbed their traditions, their customs, their gods, and in doing so, he presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as a divine liberator, a destined ruler, the embodiment of their own deepest beliefs. In Persia, he adopted the royal customs and divine titles of the Achaemenid kings, calling himself the King of Kings and dressing in the traditional Persian royal attire. He understood that to rule the Persians, he must become the ultimate Persian, a king who respected their traditions, who honored their gods, who was one of them. In Egypt, the priests proclaimed him a pharaoh, an incarnate god, the son of Zeus Ammon, a hybrid Greek-Egyptian deity. Alexander embraced this role, understanding that it elevated him beyond the realm of mere mortals, that it made him a spiritual bridge between empires, a figure of prophecy, a man favored by the gods. He reinforced this divine image with carefully crafted myths, claiming descent from Heracles and Achilles, the great heroes of Greek mythology, paragons of strength and warrior prowess. He created a cult of personality around himself, a belief that he was not just a king, but a demigod, a man whose destiny was guided by the hands of fate. The psychological impact of this strategy was profound. His own soldiers, imbued with the belief that their leader was favored by the gods, fought with a ferocity and a loyalty that was unmatched. They believed they were part of a divine mission, that they were invincible, that they were led by a man who could not be defeated. And his enemies, faced with this godlike figure, this unstoppable conqueror, were often paralyzed by fear. Ancient accounts tell of cities that surrendered without a fight, of armies that crumbled before he even arrived, of soldiers who threw themselves from cliffs rather than face the man who was said to be the son of a god. Alexander's conquests were not just military victories, they were psychological triumphs. He understood that the most powerful weapon in his arsenal was not the sarissa, the long spear of his phalanx, but the power of belief, the power of myth, the power of the human mind to shape reality itself. He was a master of the narrative, a storyteller who wove a tale of divine destiny so compelling that the world itself seemed to bend to his will. Our journey now takes us to the ancient Near East, to the land of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, a powerful and ruthless empire arose, an empire that would come to be known for its military might, its architectural wonders, and its calculated use of terror. This was the Assyrian Empire, a civilization that perfected the art of psychological warfare, that wielded brutality not as a random act of violence, but as a deliberate instrument of state policy. The Assyrians understood, perhaps better than any civilization before them, that the fear of pain could be a more powerful motivator than the promise of reward. They built their empire on a foundation of intimidation, on the carefully cultivated reputation for cruelty, on the understanding that a submissive population was a stable population. Their military culture was one of absolute ruthlessness. Their soldiers were not just trained to fight, but to instill terror. Their kings were not just conquerors, but masters of propaganda who used art, architecture, and inscriptions to broadcast their power, to remind their subjects and their enemies of the terrible consequences of defiance. The psychological landscape of the ancient Near East was one of constant conflict, of shifting alliances, of powerful city-states vying for dominance. In this world, the Assyrians carved out their empire through a combination of military superiority and psychological warfare. They understood that to control such a vast and diverse territory, they needed to break the will of their enemies, to crush their spirit, to make the very thought of rebellion unthinkable. And so they embarked on a campaign of terror, a systematic and deliberate policy of brutality that would leave an indelible mark on the pages of history. They did not just defeat their enemies, they sought to annihilate them, to erase them from memory, to make them a chilling example to all who would dare to oppose the might of Assyria. The Assyrians employed a wide range of brutal tactics to terrorize their enemies, methods that were designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological suffering. These were not the acts of a frenzied mob, but the calculated and systematic policies of a state that had perfected the art of intimidation. One of their most infamous tactics was impalement. After conquering a city, the Assyrians would often impale their victims on sharp stakes, creating gruesome forests of bodies that would be left on display as a warning to others. They took this horrific practice a step further, sometimes stabbing the stake through the victim's abdomen, ensuring a slow and agonizing death. These mass displays of impaled bodies were a powerful form of psychological warfare, a clear and terrifying message to any who might consider rebellion. Another brutal practice was flaying, the skinning of victims alive. This was not done to kill them quickly, but to prolong their suffering, to make them a living testament to the wrath of Assyria. The skins of the flayed would then be displayed on the city walls, a gruesome tapestry of terror that would greet any approaching army. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a man known for his intellect and his ruthlessness, took this practice to a new level. He would not only flay his enemies, but he would also have their flesh systematically carved off and preserved, creating what he called gifts of flesh. He would then present these gruesome trophies to other leaders, a chilling reminder of the consequences of opposing him. These methods, as brutal as they were, served a strategic purpose. They were designed to break the will of the enemy, to create a climate of fear, to make the cost of resistance so high that surrender seemed the only viable option. The Assyrians were masters of terror, and their empire, built on a foundation of fear, stands as a testament to the dark and brutal side of ancient warfare. We now travel to the rugged hills of Laconia, to the city-state of Sparta, a society that was not just organized for war, but was itself a weapon of war. The Spartans were a people who dedicated their entire existence to the art of combat, who forged their children into the most feared warriors of the ancient world. And at the heart of this transformation was a brutal and unforgiving system of education known as the agoge. The agoge was not just a school, it was a crucible, a place where boys were stripped of their individuality, their family ties, their very sense of self, and remade into cogs in the great Spartan war machine. The philosophy behind this system was simple: to create a society of soldiers, a brotherhood of warriors whose loyalty was not to their families, but to the state, to their brothers in arms, to the phalanx. The psychological transformation began at birth. When a Spartan child was born, it was inspected by the elders of the city. If the infant was deemed weak or deformed, it was left to die on a mountainside. Only the strong were allowed to live, only the fit were deemed worthy of becoming Spartans. At the age of 7, the boys were taken from their families and entered the agoge. They were organized into packs and herds, living and training together under the watchful eyes of their instructors. They were taught to endure hardship, to obey commands without question, to value the group above the individual. They were taught that the greatest glory was to die for Sparta, that the greatest shame was to show fear. The daily life of a Spartan boy in the agoge was a relentless cycle of hardship and deprivation. They were given little food, forced to steal to survive, and severely beaten if they were caught. This was not a punishment for the act of stealing, but for the carelessness of being discovered. It was a lesson in cunning, in stealth, in the art of survival. There is a famous story told by the ancient historian Plutarch of a Spartan boy who had stolen a fox and was hiding it under his cloak. To avoid being discovered, the boy allowed the fox to tear out his bowels with its teeth and claws, dying in silence rather than revealing his theft. This story, whether true or not, illustrates the extreme lengths to which Spartan boys were pushed, the incredible pain they were expected to endure without complaint. Their physical conditioning was just as brutal. They were forced to go barefoot, to sleep on beds of reeds that they had to break by hand, to exercise naked in all weather. They were taught to speak in a clipped, concise manner, to express themselves in as few words as possible. This was the origin of the term laconic, a reflection of the Spartan belief that action spoke louder than words. The agoge was a system designed to create the perfect soldier, a warrior who was physically tough, mentally disciplined, and emotionally numb. It was a system that produced the most feared army in ancient Greece, an army that was said to be invincible. But it was also a system that came at a terrible cost, a system that sacrificed the individual for the sake of the state, that turned boys into killing machines, that created a society that knew only war. Our journey now takes us to the heart of the ancient world, to the city that would become an empire, to Rome. The Romans were not just conquerors. They were builders, engineers, lawmakers, and masters of military organization. Their legions were the most effective fighting force of their time, a testament to the power of discipline, of training, of a system that turned ordinary men into extraordinary soldiers. The Roman military system was built on a foundation of discipline. Every soldier was expected to obey orders without question, to follow the rules to the letter, to be a reliable part of the larger whole. This discipline was not just a matter of battlefield tactics, it was a way of life, a psychological conditioning that began the moment a man enlisted in the legion. The training was relentless. Soldiers were drilled in the use of their weapons, the gladius and the pilum, the short sword and the heavy javelin. They were taught to march for miles with heavy packs, to build fortified camps every night, to work together as a cohesive unit. They were taught to be self-sufficient, to be resilient, to be Roman soldiers. The psychological impact of this training was profound. It created a sense of camaraderie, of brotherhood, of shared identity. It instilled a sense of pride, of belonging to something greater than oneself. It forged a bond between the soldiers that was stronger than any fear, any hardship, any enemy. The Romans were not just masters of the pitched battle, they were also masters of siege warfare, the art of conquering fortified cities. They understood that a city's walls were not just physical barriers, but also psychological ones. To conquer a city, they had to break not just its defenses, but also its spirit. Roman siege tactics were a combination of engineering prowess and psychological pressure. They would surround a city, cutting off its supplies, its communication, its hope. They would build massive siege engines, towering siege towers, and powerful catapults that would rain destruction down upon the city's defenders. They would dig tunnels, undermine walls, and create a constant sense of threat, of impending doom. The psychological warfare of a Roman siege was relentless. The defenders, trapped within their walls, would slowly starve. They would watch their supplies dwindle, their hope fade, their world shrink. They would be subjected to a constant barrage of noise, of threats, of the terrifying sights and sounds of the Roman war machine. The famous siege of Veii, an Etruscan city that was a rival of Rome, lasted for 10 years. For a decade, the people of Veii were trapped, isolated, slowly worn down by the relentless pressure of the Roman army. In the end, it was not a final assault that conquered the city, but the slow, agonizing process of psychological attrition. The Romans understood that the most powerful weapon in a siege was not the battering ram, but time. They knew that hunger, fear, and despair could be more effective than any army. And they used this understanding to build an empire that would last for 1,000 years. We now journey to the vast steppes of Central Asia, to the heart of the Mongol Empire, a dominion forged by the most successful conqueror in human history, Genghis Khan. The Mongols were a nomadic people, a nation of horsemen, who under the leadership of Genghis Khan would create the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. And they did it not just with their military might, but with a calculated and ruthless campaign of psychological warfare. Genghis Khan was a master of terror. He understood that fear was a weapon, that a reputation for brutality could be more effective than any army. He did not just defeat his enemies, he sought to annihilate them, to erase them from the face of the earth, to make them a chilling example to all who would dare to oppose him. The Mongol strategy was simple and brutal. When they arrived at a city, they would offer terms of surrender. If the city accepted, its people would be spared, though they would be forced to pay tribute to the Mongol Empire. But if the city resisted, it would face a terrible fate. The Mongols would unleash a torrent of violence, a storm of destruction that would leave nothing standing. They would slaughter the city's inhabitants, men, women, and children, with a ruthless efficiency. They would burn the city to the ground, leaving behind only ruins and a chilling silence. But the Mongols were not just mindless savages. Their brutality was calculated, strategic. They would often spare a few survivors, who would then flee to other cities, spreading tales of the Mongol terror, of the mountains of skulls, of the rivers of blood. These stories, amplified and exaggerated as they were passed from person to person, would precede the Mongol army, sowing fear and despair in its path. The Mongols also used sensory warfare to terrify their enemies. They would attack from multiple directions, their horsemen appearing as if from nowhere, their drums and horns creating a deafening wall of sound, their blood-curdling battle cries echoing across the battlefield. They would create a sense of chaos, of overwhelming power, of an unstoppable force of nature. Genghis Khan understood the power of information. He used the marketplace, the ancient network of trade and communication, to spread rumors, to inflate his reputation, to create a myth of invincibility around himself and his army. He was a master of propaganda, a warlord who conquered not just with the sword, but with the story. The Mongol terror machine was one of the most effective examples of psychological warfare in human history. It was a system that used fear, brutality, and propaganda to conquer a vast and diverse empire, a system that left a legacy of terror that would echo through the centuries. Our journey now takes us into the darkest corners of the ancient world, to the realm of torture and execution, where the line between justice and cruelty blurred, where pain was not just a punishment, but a spectacle, a form of psychological warfare designed to terrify and control. In ancient Greece, in the city of Akragas, a tyrant named Phalaris commissioned a new and horrific instrument of execution, the brazen bull. It was a hollow bronze statue of a bull with a door in its side. The condemned person would be placed inside, the door would be locked, and a fire would be lit beneath the bull. As the bronze heated up, the person inside would be slowly roasted to death, their screams amplified by a system of tubes and pipes emerging from the bull's mouth as a terrifying roar. The brazen bull was not just a method of execution, it was a work of art, a masterpiece of cruelty, a symbol of the tyrant's absolute power. It was a clear and terrifying message to all who would dare to oppose him. This is what happens to my enemies. But the story of the brazen bull has a grimly ironic twist. When the inventor, Perillos of Athens, presented his creation to Phalaris, the tyrant decided that Perillos should be the first to test it. Perillos was placed inside the bull, and the fire was lit. He was taken out before he died, but Phalaris then had him thrown from a cliff. In the end, the people of Akragas, tired of Phalaris' cruelty, rose up against him and, in a final act of poetic justice, executed him in his own brazen bull. Of all the brutal methods of execution in the ancient world, perhaps none was as widespread, as public, or as psychologically devastating as crucifixion. It was a punishment that was not just about ending a life, but about making that ending as slow, as painful, and as humiliating as possible. Crucifixion was used by many ancient cultures, from the Persians to the Carthaginians to the Romans. It was a punishment reserved for the lowest of the low, for slaves, for rebels, for those who dared to challenge the authority of the state. The process of crucifixion was designed to maximize suffering. The victim would be nailed or tied to a wooden cross, their arms outstretched, their body exposed to the elements. They would be left to hang for days, slowly dying from a combination of suffocation, dehydration, and exhaustion. Their death would be a public spectacle, a warning to all who passed by. The Romans, in particular, were masters of crucifixion. They would often crucify thousands of people at a time, creating gruesome forests of crosses along the roads leading to their cities. This was mass psychological warfare, a clear and terrifying message to any who might consider rebellion. This is the fate that awaits you. Crucifixion was not just a physical torture, it was a psychological one. It was a punishment that stripped the victim of their dignity, their humanity, their very identity. It was a death that was designed to be as shameful as it was painful, a death that would be remembered as a symbol of the ultimate power of the state. As we reflect on these brutal practices, we are reminded of the dark side of human nature, of the capacity for cruelty that lies within us all. But we are also reminded of the resilience of the human spirit, of the courage of those who dare to defy the tyrants, of the enduring hope for a world where such brutality is a thing of the past. Before we conclude our journey, let us venture into the misty forests of ancient Europe to the lands of the Celts, a people whose approach to warfare was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs, their connection to the natural world, and their understanding of the sacred nature of combat. The Celtic warriors were not just fighters, they were participants in a cosmic drama, actors in a sacred ritual that connected the world of the living with the realm of the gods. Their battles were not merely conflicts over territory or resources, but spiritual contests, tests of divine favor, ceremonies that determined the will of the gods. At the heart of Celtic warfare was the Druidic tradition, a complex system of beliefs and practices that governed every aspect of Celtic life. The Druids were more than priests. They were judges, teachers, healers, and keepers of the sacred knowledge. They understood the mysteries of life and death, the cycles of nature, the hidden connections between all things. Before any major battle, the Druids would perform elaborate rituals, seeking the favor of the gods, divining the outcome of the conflict, preparing the warriors for the sacred act of combat. They would sacrifice animals, sometimes even humans, offering their blood to the earth, their spirits to the sky. They would read the omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of clouds, the whispers of the wind. The Celtic warriors themselves were a fearsome sight. They would paint their bodies with blue woad, creating intricate patterns that were both decorative and protective. They would wear their hair long and wild, sometimes stiffened with lime to create a terrifying appearance. They would charge into battle naked or nearly naked, their war cries echoing across the battlefield, their weapons gleaming in the sun. This was psychological warfare of a different kind, not the calculated terror of the Assyrians or the disciplined intimidation of the Romans, but a wild, primal display of courage and ferocity that was designed to inspire their own warriors and strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Perhaps the most distinctive and unsettling aspect of Celtic warfare was their practice of headhunting, the taking of enemy heads as trophies of war. This was not merely a barbaric custom, but a deeply spiritual practice rooted in the Celtic belief that the head was the seat of the soul, the repository of a person's essence, their power, their identity. To the Celts, the head was sacred. It was the part of the body that contained the spirit, the consciousness, the divine spark that animated the flesh. By taking the head of a fallen enemy, a Celtic warrior was not just claiming a trophy, he was capturing the enemy's soul, absorbing their power, adding their strength to his own. The heads of fallen enemies would be carefully preserved, sometimes mummified, sometimes simply dried and displayed. They would be hung from the warrior's belt, mounted on the walls of his home, or placed in sacred groves as offerings to the gods. The more heads a warrior possessed, the greater his status, the more feared and respected he became. This practice had a profound psychological impact on both the Celts and their enemies. For the Celtic warriors, it was a source of power and prestige, a tangible proof of their prowess in battle. For their enemies, particularly the Romans, it was a source of horror and revulsion, a reminder of the savage and alien nature of these northern barbarians. This was warfare as ritual, combat as ceremony, violence as a sacred act. It was a worldview that was fundamentally different from the pragmatic, political approach of the Romans. A perspective that saw battle not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, a way of communing with the divine, of proving one's worth in the eyes of the gods. Our journey now takes us to the cold waters of the North Sea, to the fjords of Scandinavia, to the age of the Vikings. These were the seafaring warriors of the medieval period, men who struck terror into the hearts of their enemies, not just through their military prowess, but through their apparent immunity to fear, their willingness to embrace death, their cultivation of a warrior culture that glorified violence and celebrated the brutal realities of combat. Among the most feared of all Viking warriors were the berserkers, men who fought in a trance-like state of fury, who seemed to be possessed by the spirits of wild animals, who charged into battle with such ferocity that they appeared to be more beast than man. The word berserker itself means bear shirt, a reference to the bear pelts that these warriors wore into battle, a symbol of their connection to the primal power of the wild. The berserkers were not just fierce fighters, they were religious fanatics, devotees of Odin, the one-eyed god of war and death. They believed that by entering into a state of divine fury, they could channel the power of the gods, become vessels for divine wrath, instruments of cosmic justice. They would work themselves into a frenzy through ritual dancing, chanting, and the consumption of various substances, possibly including hallucinogenic mushrooms. In this altered state, the berserkers were said to be immune to pain, to fire, to iron. They would bite their shields, howl like animals, and foam at the mouth. They would charge into battle without armor, relying on their divine protection, their supernatural strength, their complete absence of fear. They were the embodiment of the Viking ideal of the warrior, men who had transcended the normal human limitations, who had become something more than mortal. The psychological impact of the berserkers was immense. Their enemies, faced with these howling, foam-flecked warriors who seemed to feel no pain, who fought with the strength of wild animals, who appeared to welcome death, would often break and flee before the battle had even begun. The berserkers were living weapons of psychological warfare, human embodiments of the terror and chaos of war. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were raiders, entrepreneurs of violence, men who had turned warfare into a business, who had created an entire economy based on the systematic plundering of their neighbors. Their long ships, sleek and fast, could appear without warning on any coast, striking like lightning and disappearing before any effective resistance could be organized. The Viking raids were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations, strategic strikes designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. They would target monasteries and churches, knowing that these religious institutions were repositories of wealth filled with gold, silver, and precious artifacts, but defended by monks and priests who had no military training. The psychological impact of these raids was devastating. The Vikings would strike without warning, usually at dawn when their victims were still asleep. They would kill anyone who resisted, take captives to sell as slaves, and burn what they could not carry away. They would leave behind a trail of destruction, a message of terror that would spread throughout the region. The mere sight of Viking sails on the horizon was enough to send entire communities into panic. People would flee their homes, abandon their possessions, seek refuge in forests and mountains. The Vikings had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the actual reach of their raids, a psychological dominion that was maintained through reputation and rumor. This was warfare as terrorism, violence as a tool of economic exploitation. The Vikings understood that fear was a commodity, that terror could be harvested and traded, that the threat of violence could be as valuable as violence itself. They created a protection racket on a continental scale, demanding tribute from communities that wanted to avoid being raided, offering their services as mercenaries to rulers who wanted to use their fearsome reputation for their own purposes. Let us return once more to the Mongol Empire to witness one of the most devastating examples of psychological warfare in human history, the siege and destruction of Baghdad in 1258. This was not just a military conquest, but an act of cultural annihilation, a deliberate attempt to erase one of the greatest centers of learning and civilization from the face of the earth. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of the Abbasid Caliphate, was home to the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries in the world. It was a center of learning, of science, of philosophy, a place where scholars from across the known world came to study and debate. It was a symbol of Islamic civilization at its height, a testament to the power of knowledge and culture. When the Mongol army, led by Hulagu Khan, arrived at the gates of Baghdad, they offered the usual terms: surrender and live, resist and die. The Caliph al-Mustasim, confident in the strength of his city's walls and the protection of Allah, chose to resist. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The Mongols besieged the city for 13 days, using their superior siege engines and tactics to breach the walls. When they finally entered Baghdad, they unleashed a torrent of destruction that was unprecedented in its scope and brutality. They killed hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps as many as 1 million. They destroyed the House of Wisdom, throwing its priceless manuscripts into the Tigris River, which was said to run black with ink for days. The destruction of Baghdad was not just a military victory, it was a psychological weapon of mass destruction. The Mongols were sending a message to the entire Islamic world. This is what happens to those who resist us. No city, no matter how great, no matter how sacred, is safe from our wrath. The Mongols were not just masters of battlefield tactics, they were also pioneers of military intelligence, creators of one of the most sophisticated information networks in the ancient world. They understood that knowledge was power, that information could be as valuable as any weapon, that the ability to know your enemy's plans, strengths, and weaknesses could determine the outcome of a war before the first arrow was fired. The Mongol intelligence network was vast and complex, stretching across continents, connecting spies, merchants, diplomats, and travelers in a web of information that fed back to the Khan and his generals. They would send envoys to enemy cities, ostensibly for diplomatic purposes, but actually to gather intelligence about defenses, supplies, and morale. They would recruit local informants, people who had grievances against their rulers, who could be bought or coerced into providing information. They would use merchants and traders who moved freely across borders to carry messages and gather intelligence. They would even use prisoners of war, offering them their lives in exchange for information about their former comrades. This intelligence network allowed the Mongols to plan their campaigns with unprecedented precision. They would know exactly where to strike, when to strike, and how to strike for maximum effect. They would know which cities were well defended and which were vulnerable, which rulers were popular and which were despised, which armies were strong and which were weak. The psychological impact of this intelligence network was immense. The Mongols seemed to know everything, to see everything, to be everywhere at once. Their enemies felt exposed, vulnerable, unable to keep any secrets. It created a sense of paranoia, of helplessness, of being watched by an all-seeing eye. This was information warfare, psychological operations on a scale that would not be seen again until the modern era. The Mongols had created a system that turned knowledge into terror, that used information as a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Our journey through the brutal world of ancient warfare would not be complete without visiting the ancient civilization of China, a land that produced not only some of the most sophisticated military strategies in history, but also the most profound philosophical reflections on the nature of war itself. In the 6th century BCE, a Chinese general and philosopher named Sun Tzu wrote a treatise that would become one of the most influential works on military strategy ever created, The Art of War. But Sun Tzu's approach to warfare was fundamentally different from the brutal, direct methods we have encountered in our journey. His was a philosophy of subtlety, of deception, of winning without fighting. Sun Tzu understood that the supreme excellence in war was not to win 100 battles, but to subdue the enemy without fighting at all. He believed that the greatest victory was achieved not through brute force, but through superior strategy, through the manipulation of information, through the art of making the enemy defeat himself. All warfare is based on deception, Sun Tzu wrote. When able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. This was psychological warfare raised to the level of high art, a sophisticated understanding of the human mind and its vulnerabilities. Sun Tzu recognized that the enemy's perception of reality was often more important than reality itself, that a well-crafted illusion could be more powerful than any army. The period known as the Warring States, from the 7th to the 3rd centuries BCE, was one of the most violent and chaotic eras in Chinese history. It was a time when the old feudal order had collapsed, when dozens of independent kingdoms fought for supremacy, when warfare was constant and brutal, when survival depended on military innovation and strategic cunning. During this period, Chinese military technology advanced rapidly. The crossbow was perfected, creating a weapon that could penetrate armor and kill at long range. Iron weapons replaced bronze, making swords and spears more deadly and durable. Cavalry tactics were developed, giving armies new mobility and striking power. But perhaps more importantly, this was also a period of psychological innovation, a time when Chinese strategists developed sophisticated methods of deception, espionage, and propaganda. They understood that information was a weapon, that rumors could be as deadly as arrows, that the right word in the right ear could topple a kingdom. Chinese armies would use double agents, feeding false information to their enemies while gathering intelligence about their plans. They would spread disinformation, creating confusion and doubt in enemy ranks. They would use propaganda to undermine enemy morale, to turn allies against each other, to create the conditions for victory before the battle had even begun. One famous example of Chinese psychological warfare was the use of empty fort strategy, where a commander would deliberately leave his fortress undefended, with the gates wide open, creating the impression that it was a trap. Enemy forces, suspecting an ambush, would often retreat without attacking, allowing the apparently weak defender to achieve victory through pure psychological manipulation. As we near the end of our long journey through the brutal world of ancient warfare, it is worth reflecting on how these early methods of psychological warfare evolved and influenced the conduct of war throughout history. The techniques we have explored, the use of terror, the manipulation of information, the cultivation of fearsome reputations, did not disappear with the fall of the ancient empires. Instead, they evolved, adapted, and found new expression in each successive age. The medieval period saw the continuation of many ancient practices. The Crusades were fought not just with swords and siege engines, but with propaganda and religious fervor. The Mongol methods of terror were adopted and refined by later conquerors. The Viking tradition of raiding evolved into the naval warfare of the medieval and early modern periods. The Renaissance and the early modern period brought new technologies, gunpowder, cannons, firearms, but also new methods of psychological warfare. The printing press allowed for the mass production of propaganda. The development of professional armies created new opportunities for discipline and training. The rise of nation-states brought new forms of political warfare. The Industrial Age saw the mechanization of warfare, the development of weapons of unprecedented destructive power. But it also saw the refinement of psychological techniques, the use of mass media for propaganda, the development of intelligence agencies, the creation of total war strategies that targeted not just enemy armies, but entire populations. What does this long history of brutal warfare tell us about human nature? What can we learn from these ancient examples of cruelty, terror, and psychological manipulation? These are difficult questions, questions that have no easy answers, questions that force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our species. On one hand, the history of warfare reveals the darker aspects of human nature, our capacity for violence, our willingness to inflict suffering on others, our ability to dehumanize our enemies. The methods we have explored in our journey are testament to human ingenuity, applied to the most destructive purposes, creativity channeled into the service of death and terror. But on the other hand, this same history also reveals more positive aspects of human nature, our capacity for courage, our willingness to sacrifice for others, our ability to endure incredible hardships in service of our beliefs. The same species that created the brazen bull also produced heroes who died rather than betray their comrades, philosophers who sought to understand the nature of conflict, leaders who tried to minimize the suffering of war. Perhaps most importantly, the history of warfare shows us the power of human choice. The brutal methods we have explored were not inevitable. They were choices made by individuals and societies. And just as humans chose to develop these methods, they also chose to abandon them, to develop laws of war, to create international institutions dedicated to peace. The ancient world was indeed more brutal than we might imagine, but it was also the foundation upon which our modern world was built. By understanding this history, by confronting these uncomfortable truths, we can better appreciate the progress that has been made and the work that still needs to be done. And so our long journey through the brutal world of ancient warfare comes to an end. We have traveled across continents and through millennia, from the psychological mastery of Alexander the Great to the calculated terror of the Assyrians, from the disciplined brutality of Sparta to the systematic cruelty of Rome, from the wild fury of the Celtic berserkers to the cold efficiency of the Mongol war machine. We have seen how fear was weaponized, how terror was systematized, how the human capacity for violence was channeled into instruments of state policy. We have witnessed the dark side of human ingenuity, the terrible creativity that went into devising new methods of inflicting pain, of breaking spirits, of crushing the will to resist. But we have also seen something else, the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to endure incredible hardships, the courage to resist even in the face of overwhelming terror. We have seen how these ancient methods, brutal as they were, ultimately failed to create lasting peace, how empires built on fear eventually crumbled, how the human desire for freedom and dignity proved stronger than any weapon of terror. As you lie here now, in the comfort and safety of your modern world, take a moment to appreciate how far we have come. The brutal methods we have explored tonight are largely relegated to the history books, replaced by international laws, by human rights, by institutions dedicated to peace and justice. But do not let this knowledge make you complacent. The capacity for both good and evil that we have seen in our journey through ancient history still exists within us today. The choice between brutality and compassion, between fear and understanding, between war and peace, is a choice that each generation must make anew. Let the stories we have shared tonight serve not as entertainment, but as education. Let them remind you of the importance of empathy, of the value of human dignity, of the need to choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over fear. And now, as these ancient echoes fade into the mists of time, let your mind also fade. Let your thoughts drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. There is nothing more to learn tonight, nothing more to understand. Simply allow yourself to sink into the peaceful darkness of sleep, to rest in the knowledge that you live in a world that, for all its imperfections, is far kinder than the brutal world of our ancestors. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be filled with peace, with understanding, with hope for a future that is even kinder than our present.